Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Hangouts and Headlines. And if you're looking at your screen and saying, wait, didn't we just have a Hangouts and Headlines? We did. We did one last week, and we're doing one this week. And with a little luck, we'll be doing Hangouts and Headlines on average about once a week. Probably not every week. I am doing a lot of kind of pulse taking as to what I can handle and what I can do on streaming and otherwise. But I'd like to do a Hangouts and Headlines probably in the middle of the week at about 10 a.m. Eastern most weeks, provided a story pops up that I think is worth talking about. I don't want to waste your time any more than I want to waste mine. So I'm excited about this episode. I think we've got a lot to talk about. If you're interested in late night comedians, there's a lot to talk about. If you're not interested in that, there's a lot to talk about. We've got some commentary to make about the way the media reports on the media. Some thoughts I have on certain kind of ticks that you can see in the writing that some of these outlets use that I think are useful to apply to things that are of more importance than whether Stephen Colbert still has a late night talk show. And we can also talk about presidential powers, the use of statutes to give broad authority to agencies to curtail things like mergers and acquisitions, and the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, overall. So if all that sounds boring, my job is to make it not boring. So please stick with us. We're going to do the Hangout section first. We're going to talk to the community. We're going to take your comments and questions about any of this, anything you've got going on in your head or you want to ask me or otherwise converse on. We're doing Hangouts right now. And then when we get to the headlines, in maybe a half hour or a little under, I will mark that in the description so that if you're watching this on YouTube later on, there will be a chapter to start with the headlines. So I know I got a few comments last week because we didn't do Hangouts and Headlines for a while that said, hey, why do you do that Hangouts portion? Just skip to the headlines. I will always talk about the headlines as much as I can and talk you through everything that I want to talk about on that topic. But this is a community-based show. It was originally headlines way back when in 2022, and then it became Hangouts and Headlines because I want to have these conversations with you all. What's most important to me about this channel, this subject, and this platform that I have is that we can have good conversations that hopefully allow for reasonable minds to differ and to have a better understanding of the world and those around us from having these conversations. And that's a part of the Hangout section of these shows. So if you have a problem with that, I don't blame you. If you don't like that, there's lots of shows on YouTube that I don't like. Please pop in for the headlines, check out the chapters after the fact, or otherwise just come in a little bit later on and I'll be talking about more substance. But for right now, how are you all doing out there? Wherever you're calling in or chatting in from, let me know. I've got a poll up asking who your favorite late night talk show host is. I think Johnny Carson, I see in the chat, was one of my favorites as well. I didn't include any of the older guard, Letterman, Leno, whoever it might be, in your particular neck of the woods. But I did include the current late night talk show host because that is an important point of the conversation that we're going to have today. So let me know in that poll, let me know in the comments, and I will try to flag them when I can. I think it's an interesting question. I think one of the aspects of this conversation we're about to have is that I would be surprised if all too many of you had a current favorite late night talk show host, because I don't think as many people as used to are watching the late night comedians talk about things like movie stars and movie projects. So let me know on that as well. If you just say, hey, I don't watch any of this crap, that's fine too. But I'm curious about the question, so let me know of that. Weird Sister, good afternoon in the UK. Happy time zone, as I think Against the Tide, one of our fantastic mods here, says all the time. It's always interesting to hear from people that are in those different time zones because it does feel a little bit like time travel, right? They're in the afternoon. That's hard for me to believe. I'm in the morning here in Southeast Michigan. So I hope you're having a good afternoon. I hope you've already had a good day, Weird Sister. I have not yet experienced my day, so I hope mine is good as well. And I'm going to try to slow down a little bit. I'm a little over-caffeinated this morning because I wanted to make sure I brought some energy to this conversation today. But one of the things I'm really focusing on is slowing down a little, slowing down my speech, making sure I take sips of whatever drink I have on the show so that I don't just start a coughing fit an hour in like I've been used to doing. So please bear with me as I learn my new patterns to have these shows and conversations with you all. Let's see. Penguin322 says Craig Ferguson was the last enjoyable late night host. I think I knew Craig Ferguson best from the Drew Carey show. I don't think I ever watched his talk show. I believe he was the boss on Drew Carey. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I think that's where I knew that person from. And so I didn't watch that show, but I have heard good things about it in the past. I think I didn't much love him when he took over the Tonight Show. And the Conan show is a little bit hard for me to take as of right now. So I don't really watch any of these people either. I don't have a ton of time to do so. I'm not usually awake at the time that they broadcast. But here's Dad flagging in Thomas Hoeg from Northville, Michigan. Yes, I know where you are, Dad. You're right down the street. Nana and Grampsy, my parents. Thank you so much for the support for the channel, everybody. I really appreciate it. And certainly I appreciate my parents for, bringing me into the world. They've done some work here to make this show happen. So thank you for the $2 and for all the other dollars and effort that you spent so that I could do things like Hangouts and Headlines, Dad. Appreciate it. Let's see. Tony P says that Craig Ferguson was the boss on the Drew Carey show. So glad I could bring that really important tidbit of information from the annals of my brain to you all today. Let's see here. Me and Maya says I don't watch any because I'm in bed that early or that late. I'm the same. So no judgment here, certainly. Emily Aaron says, wait, does Watch What Happens Live with Andy Cohen on Bravo count? If so, then Andy Cohen is my favorite host currently. That's a show where they talk specifically about the Bravo antics of the reality shows on the channel, right? So I don't think I've ever watched that either, but I do know of its existence. So yeah, I believe that counts for this purpose. One of the things I would offer on late night talk shows in general is that the kind of dearth of movie stars, of people that actually sell movie tickets just for their presence in a movie, makes the concept of the talk show as kind of invented in the earlier days of television antiquated in and of itself, right? There just aren't people that you can sit across from a talk show host in late night and make sure that you're going to have a fun and interesting conversation that the audience is going to care about. So I think that's a part of this story, and we'll see how CNN reports on it in just a minute. Robbie Dobby says, good morning, Papa Hoeg. Yes, say hi to Grampsy. Fantastic to see Nana and Grampsy supporting the channel and watching the show. I hope you find some good content here to talk to me about later. I always accept constructive criticism. So let me know, Mom and Dad, certainly. Let's see here. What else we have? Tony P says, mostly I just catch a little bit of Jimmy Fallon before he comes on after the late local news. Not a fan. I do think sometimes you're watching the late news and it just trips over into whatever the late night show is for that channel. But yeah, I just can't honestly say that I watch many of these at all. I sometimes see clips on social media, but not often. There was a time when clips from these shows on social media seemed to be more prevalent, and I don't really recall seeing them very recently, if at all. So it's certainly a downward slide for late night talk show hosts and the late night talk show format in general. I think it's honestly a downward slide for broadcast television in general. You all are here with me in the chat on a YouTube channel with a lawyer talking about things like media reporting. So I think people are getting their content and their substance elsewhere. I think overall that's a good thing because you can get things that are more exciting for you as a person to listen to or to watch. I think there is a certain loss of kind of connected community. I do miss a little bit the days when you could come in to work and talk about the episode of Lost that you just watched. That was so exciting, and that you have a conversation with your assistant or your colleagues or whatever else. And that was a conversation point. I really don't see that much anymore, and I miss that. But I do think that what we get in exchange for that is probably more valuable to people more often, which is a kind of curated entertainment experience for each individual that can provide what they like more than just what these massive groups of people like. So that's my own kind of editorial comment on the state of broadcast TV as it stands today. Diana B says, yes, I rarely watch any legacy media. Yes, I'm certainly not legacy media here at Hangouts and Headlines. So I appreciate you being here. And I think a lot of people are the same way. I still read the news quite often. I do what I used to call my pre-work sit, where I kind of go through various news outlets and look at things that are of interest to me to kind of try to get a feel for what's happening out there in the world. Social media has taken over that a little bit, but I don't find it to be very truth-oriented as a platform. So I don't use it to just kind of get my understanding of the world as it stands today. But I don't otherwise watch television news very often. I read it more often than anything else. That's why Hangouts and Headlines is Hangouts and Headlines. Spencer Presley says, did anyone see the Jon Stewart coverage of the last week? Obviously more than a bit biased with Colbert, but had to be my favorite discussion on TV about the whole Paramount decision, ironically, on Comedy Central, on CC. I saw only a brief clip of it. I did not see it entirely. Obviously, for those that don't know, Stephen Colbert came up with Jon Stewart's Daily Show. He was a commentator, fake commentator, essentially doing the comedy news for that show way back in the day before he became more prominent in things like the Late Show that we're going to talk about today. It is undoubtedly the case that Jon Stewart feels that his friend and colleague has been wronged on this. I have no issue with any human being reacting that way to a human being they know personally. Whether or not that is a function of what the president is doing and the executive branch and everything else is something that we're going to talk about today. So we'll get into that in just a minute. Social Mail says, hi from Paris, France. I'm originally from New York City. I also studied in Ann Arbor. I watch Stephen Colbert's monologue and replay every morning with my coffee. Well, see, that's good to know. And I love that history there. Obviously, I have a big connection with Ann Arbor as a Michigan Wolverine myself. Many of my clients come through the University of Michigan being based in Ann Arbor. And so I love all of that. I think it's interesting to hear about different people's connections with these hosts and the content that they produce. So thank you for sharing that with me. And I'm interested in seeing how you feel about this story when we get done with it, because Stephen Colbert is not going to be with us making those monologues for your morning coffee much longer. So Allegan News says social media can be good for news only if you are selective in who you follow and just look at it in time order, no algorithm. Yeah, the For You feed from things like Twitter do tend to skew things from time to time. I think social media is a valuable tool, a valuable platform in certain respects, and that you can get like the headlines, the news items of the day from various outlets, and you can see how different outlets are kind of triangulating around various existing policy or political preferences. I think that's a very interesting thing to do on my own. I wish that you didn't have to do it quite as much as you did to kind of sift through some of the detritus that exists in these articles that unfortunately we are going to talk about a little bit today. Emily Aaron says, I work from home, so there's no proverbial water cooler to gather around anyway. Actually, one of my coworkers watches some of the same YouTube channels as I do. Yeah, it's the company Slack now, right? Or the Microsoft Teams, or the Discord, if you're more on the gaming side of things, where you have these conversations. I think that's the modern kind of computer-based water cooler. But it is the case that, especially after the pandemic, there isn't that much physical proximity to a lot of the things that we do, right? One of the reasons that I closed my office, Hoeg Law's office, was because clients just basically refused to meet in person on anything that didn't require an in-person physical signature. And it just didn't make sense to pay those lease amounts anymore, combined with the fact that they were being increased with all of the tumult in the economy. And so I am very sympathetic to those that say, well, I don't really physically see anybody in respect to my work anymore, because as a lawyer, mostly the firm exists as part of my brain and my laptop and can go anywhere, but it also means that you don't have that physical connection with any specific place anymore. Witness Multi-Chick says, I'm happy to see Colbert's gloves are off with the cancel news. Happy face smiling emoji. And yes, we're going to pick up on that as well as part of the stories that I have selected for us today. We do see President Trump commenting on the cancellation. We do see Stephen Colbert's retort to President Trump's commentary. That's a part of this story. So I'm going to cover that. You can rest assured of that fact. Spencer Presley says, by the way, that the office is closed. Does that mean more funds went to the Hoeg Law mansion? Smiling, laughing emoji. No, not so much. Mostly after the pandemic, we've been trying to make sure that the budget can work to keep the lights on and the family fed. And part of that was making some hard decisions and hard cuts in what it is that we could afford as both a family and a firm. And so the office was one of the things that I cut. Coming home from the hospital after the stroke, after the pandemic, just seeing it not being a terribly useful thing to spend money on. So I appreciate it. We definitely don't have a mansion, but I certainly appreciate all the support from people like you, Spencer, and people like Shell. Thank you so much for gifting 5 Hoeg Law memberships. I really appreciate that. Every little bit helps. I know I say that at the end of most of my videos. I try to do it at the end of all my videos, but I forget sometimes. But in all honesty, I couldn't do any of this. I couldn't have these conversations. I couldn't be here, honestly, without the support of folks like you. I know I've mentioned it in the past. You guys were so supportive with me coming out of the hospital. You've been so supportive as I try to bring aspects of the channel back, and I say things like I'd like to do this every week in the middle of the week. I know I'm probably not going to hit that every single time, because there are just days and there are honestly just weeks where that energy level isn't there. And I can't tell you whether that's part of the stroke, part of the aging, what have you. I want to be at my 2022 level, making 14 videos a week for y'all. I'm definitely not going to do that. That's definitely not going to happen again. Honestly, it put me in the hospital, so I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, but know that I am wired to want to work. I'm wired to want to work for you. And if you don't see me for a little while, it's not for lack of trying on my part. I really want to communicate that. I really appreciate all of you. And I really feel bad when there's some kind of big news item that I get 100 DMs on, and I say, I just can't get up to making that video today. And it does happen from time to time. I'm not going to have another stroke, Rock Blues and BBQ. I'm not. We don't want to put that out there in the world. I'm not. But I'm also not going to work myself back into the hospital if I can avoid it. I'm much better at understanding where I'm at mentally and physically than I was back in 2022. But I still have the internal impulse to want to have these conversations, to make this content, to do these things for you, for my clients, for my family, as often as I possibly can. So I am trying. It's just not going to happen every time. PE, thank you for being a member for 35 months. Hi, Hoeg. I'm so very happy to be here live with you again. I'm happy to have you here live with us again, PE. And thank you for being a member for so long. I really appreciate the support, as I was just saying. So hopefully, when we get to the headlines in just a minute now, you will enjoy the substance of what I have to talk about today. All right. And Anna just say, I want to say, yes, health is important. Honestly, I undervalued it. I know my colleague over at Iron Lords, Lord Cognito, says health is wealth all the time. It's one of his taglines. It is the very epitome of truth. You have nothing without it, and you should be more grateful for when you have it. And even I struggle with that coming home from the hospital. So I'm trying every day to do that more often, to be grateful for what I have, to rest when I need to rest, but I'm still wired to feel like that is lazy. That is not doing every possible thing I could do with every minute of my day. I'm kind of grown up in the big law, keep working, keep billing, or sports, make every day your day, seize the day, all that kind of background information. And getting over that is part of my deprogramming efforts while still making things like this episode for you all. All right, Dad's got another super chat, and I really appreciate the super chats, Dad. Since American cancel culture took hold, humor was no longer permitted. I think it's just permitted. Late night hosts suffered and just couldn't be any good. I hope that's all over and we can have fun again. I do think that comedy in certain respects has suffered for any number of reasons. One of the reasons that I generally say on this is that social media and the internet in general has given almost too much transparency to what the audience, or at least a minority of the audience, thinks about your work. And so I see it a lot in things like movies, where I usually attribute this to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That company likes to say, okay, some people are going to make fun of us for this goofy thing in our comic book movie. And so we're going to get out in front of it. We're going to write around that. We're going to be the cool kids sitting in the back of the classroom making fun of ourselves. Hey, isn't this goofy? Isn't this ridiculous? As part of what we're doing. And that kind of meta irony that is pervasive across all forms of comedy now really takes away from the fun of it. Really takes away from getting invested in these kinds of things. And I think on the late night comedy route, the circuit, if you will, that comes up more often because they know they want to make clips out of these things and that people are going to comment on them on social media. And human beings are human beings. You can be as rich and as famous as Stephen Colbert or Johnny Carson or anyone else. You don't want to see those comments come in that make fun of something that you did or something that you said or the way that you look. And so I think people being more cognizant of that, even if they're tiny voices, makes people really concerned about what they put out there in the world in a way that I don't think is honestly very healthy for human beings. And I suffer from this from time to time too, right? I had an entire year where essentially I really wanted to provide value to you all. I really wanted to have good substance in the conversations that we were having, but I was concerned that clips of me and comments that I was making were being used in ways that I felt were taking away from the conversation and not helping it. I wound up essentially not making shows and not commenting on things that I probably should have, that I regret a little bit now, that I wanted to have commented on, and I wish those videos and commentary existed so that I could refer to them right now. But that all stems in large part for myself from a desire to do good, right? As Gandalf says in The Fellowship of the Ring, it just wound up keeping me from doing anything at all in certain important respects because I didn't want to be out there making outrage culture worse, making the internet a worse place to live. That is not what I want to be about. And so thank you all for sticking with me as I get over that personal issue to have more commentary here with you all. But I do agree, Dad, that comedians, entertainment, media in general, I think has been suffering from a lack of ability to be as truthful and honest and as you say, fun as we would want them to be entertaining. All right. I've got another super chat here from Chris Smith. Did you hear about the Shoujo agency holding out on over $500,000 to, that's the mouse streamer, IMM. I don't know them well enough to get the name right, so I apologize there. This is the nature of super chats, folks. I don't blame you for shortening these things because they only give you a certain amount of letters. So it's just a little bit difficult for me to understand. I know this particular story is that an agent for a streamer apparently took control of that streamer's accounts. Is it Immodest Mouse? Is that the right name? And part of the control of the accounts was money that had been raised for a charity. Maybe that's the IMM Deaf Foundation, right? And holding out Iron Mouse out talent funds since September. Yes, I have heard of that story. I think that's very unfortunate. I will tell you, as a contract lawyer, my first reaction to seeing that story at all was that somebody needs to lawyer up when you're negotiating these contracts. I don't blame anybody for not wanting to do that. Lawyers are expensive. We're a cost center. I get all of that. I don't think it should be necessary to live in the world, but it is. And so I do think somebody was taken advantage of with respect to the controls or the terms of the contract that they entered into. And it appears to be that this agency was entering into contracts that gave them an inordinate amount of control over the financial standing of their clients. And is there something wrong with that? Is there something illegal? Probably not, but I can't really say from here. And I have heard of that story. So thank you for flagging it for me. I don't know that I have anything else to say on it right this moment. Spencer Presley asks, you didn't have to get into it, but what are some topics you wish you could have covered more in the moment? I have a similar feeling with my own work online with podcasts and videos. You know, my stuff is so topical that I think what happens is I see the news items and I flag it as I would like to make a video about that thing. And if the next thing comes in and the next thing comes in and we're 4 items in, it starts to feel like an insurmountable mountain. And I wind up having that big section of no content for anybody, even though each individual thing could have worked, because I want to be so fulsome. I want to be so complete about the conversations that we're having that things kind of get rolled back. On my current slate, this year alone, I had a set of videos lined up that I essentially lost the prep work that I had done for, that just didn't get made on AI in general. I had a thought that I would do some AI commentary in virtual legality that was just kind of a roundup of various things that were happening. I wanted to talk about the Disney Universal lawsuit against Midjourney, because I think that's really interesting. I wanted to talk about the district court deciding that, I believe it was Anthropic's use of purchased digital files for books was a fair use under the intellectual property laws, and how that was important for talking about how AI operates, but it is not the end of this conversation. I had video plans for those kinds of things and a number of other things that I would have to find the notepad for, that essentially I find it to be most healthy to kind of say, all right, we're past the point of returns for that. Let it go, rip it up, put it in the waste bin. Don't think about it again. One thing my post-stroke brain is really good at is a total mind wipe. Like if it doesn't make it to the notebook, if it doesn't make it into some kind of thing that I have to do that is otherwise recorded in some way, it's gone forever. And so I don't think I can answer anything better on that question at this point in time. But I appreciate you asking. It does happen to me from time to time. I'm hopeful that it will happen less. But I'm also realistic in that I don't want to waste your time. I have to see a story that I really think I can add something to and that excites me to make a video like this one about in order to do one of these. I think it's likely to be about once a week, but I also don't want to force it, right? Certainly when I was doing a Hangouts and Headlines once every day of the week, there were a couple where maybe I didn't feel like I had all that much to add, but I wanted to highlight a news story and some interesting reporting, and maybe I pushed some of those. So I don't want to get into that particular routine again, but I think we'll be able to do these more often. My perfect world, just to be honest with all of you here right now, is a Hangouts and Headlines every week, maybe squeezing in a Virtual Legality every week, and at least one contribution to Last Stand Media a week. Now, those are longer form podcasts. I can tell you right now, I recorded I think 3.5 or 4 hour podcast for Last Stand, a summon sign episode yesterday. So I've done one of those that will go live, I believe, today for patrons, and then goes live later on in the week. I don't have their entire schedule down for the way that they monetize and paywall their content, but I want to do one of those Bitcasts every Sunday. So I'm not going to go hide in a hole, but I'm already doing enough things for other networks that it is an additional ask of my energy level to make videos for my own channel, which I want to get back to doing. So I appreciate the question, Spencer, and I will try to keep a better track of that and not get into that same rut again. Sherry Mills, thank you for being a member for 30 months. Yay, finally caught an H&H Live. Big toothy smile emoji. Yes, you finally caught an H&H Live. It's not like you've had a lot of opportunities in the last few months, so that's as much on me as it is on you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being a member for so long. I appreciate it. Suzanne K says, it sounds like analysis paralysis. I experience that when I have a mountain of work and can't get started. Yeah, it's one of those things where I start to feel bad after one news item goes past and a cycle goes past. And part of that is analysis paralysis. Part of that is overthinking. Part of that is that the patterns I had built before I was in the hospital were such that I really prided myself on speed. Accuracy, absolutely. But I really prided myself on, oh, that's an interesting topic. I can read that in the morning and get a video out in the afternoon. And I definitely can't do that anymore. And so it sits at least one kind of news cycle, one calendar day. And if the next thing comes in, it just starts to backlog a little bit. I'm going to try to get out of that mindset. But that's one of the things that definitely happens. Chris Smith says, I do love the banter between you and Gene Park of the Washington Post on the LSM podcast, Hoeg. Thank you, Chris. I think Gene is a great guy. He's an interesting guy. And I got to meet him in person at Colin's wedding. And Mrs. Hoeg loves him. He is a character. I can't speak enough about how wacky Gene is and how interesting his takes on video games are. I think he is one of the better reporter, journalist, reviewers that we have working in the video game industry because he takes such an unusual tack on his approach to talking about these games. Games are art, and Gene sees that. Some games journalists see it more as a commercial kind of consumer reports job. And I'm glad that the banter that we have on Last Stand Media is something that you can enjoy, Chris. So thank you. All right. So that's our Hangouts portion. I know there are other people with comments. Please do continue commenting in the chat here. But I do want to get to the substance of our conversation because we've got a lot of it to go through today. We're going to actually start on last Thursday with the article that I highlighted in the thumbnail as soon as I get this off our screen. Then that is that CBS is ending the Late Show with Stephen Colbert next year. And that's the CNN article that talks just overall about what's happening here. And then we're going to get into the business analysis in just a second. So, in a shocking move, CBS is ending the Late Show with Stephen Colbert next year and apparently exiting the late night television business altogether. The network, citing financial pressures, said the cancellation will take effect in May 2026, the normal end of the broadcast TV season. Now, the reason I'm bringing this article up first is to give us the lay of the land of what's happening here, but also to note a couple of things, right? We see the reference to this being a shocking move, but it's also referred to as something indicating that CBS is getting out of late night television altogether, which is what Colbert says as part of his monologue when he's announcing this cancellation. That, to me, reads as something that would speak against a massive conspiracy to appease the presidential administration in order to get a somewhat tangential merger approved. But put a pin in that, hold on to that, because there's more on that score as we go through these articles. The network, citing financial pressures, said the cancellation will take effect in May 2026. And that's also a note in this particular story, which is to say that it's not happening imminently, right? If you talk about pressure from the president to get your late night talk show host canceled, to move away from having him on your airwaves because of a merger, then you would assume that that pressure would need to take effect pretty quickly, that there isn't a lot of value in keeping it going till the end of next season in May 2026. And yet that's what we see here today. And I'm prepping this for you outside of the bounds of this article because we're going to take a look at a bunch of language in the business analysis here, which is going to suggest that conspiracy that I just mentioned. And I find it problematic in the way that the media has reported on this, in particular, the CNN article we're about to talk about. And I want to talk about why. The decision is particularly surprising because The Late Show is typically the highest rated show in late night. This is an area where I wanted to point out when we go through articles of all stripes, not just about entertainment, that you can get confused by statistics, right? And what's important here is to break these things down logically, to say, okay, it's the highest rated show of the time slot, but what are those ratings realistically? How much can you sell advertisement for? Because it's always a matter of numbers. It's always a matter of mathematics when we talk about business and these kinds of conversations, which is to say, I can have the highest rated show in the time slot, but if I'm spending 3 times as much, or if I'm spending more than I can make from the advertisers at all, then that doesn't really matter. And what appears to have happened here is that the late night talk show format was built in an entirely different era of television that could make an entirely different amount of money from advertising revenue. And so now in 2025, even having the best, highest rated content in that slot doesn't necessarily mean that you're making money. And there are other outlets on the internet that you can look up, that you can find if you are researching this topic, that talk about the fact that this show was losing money. CBS as a network overall is in a certain financial strait. That's one of the reasons the merger exists. And Paramount itself, the parent company, is in a certain financial strait. So there are all these reasons to believe that they are getting rid of very expensive shows that maybe don't bring in the bucks, outside of appeasement of executive agencies or the president himself. And yet, the timing is bound to raise questions, says CNN, because it comes just 2 weeks after the parent company of CBS, Paramount, settled a lawsuit lodged by President Trump against CBS News. So the framing device for this news, Stephen Colbert was canceled, The Late Show was canceled on CBS, is that it is raising questions because it was just after a lawsuit was settled in which Paramount, and we'll get to that as part of this article, agrees to pay $16 million to Trump, to President Trump, for the building of his presidential library, which mirrors another settlement that President Trump got from a different news outlet. The settlement and Paramount's pending merger with Skydance Media spurred speculation about Colbert's future at CBS. Colbert, after all, is one of the staunchest critics of Trump on television. Now, a couple of things to note here. I've highlighted after all. This is strange. This is a strange bit of reporting here on CNN Business because I did not personally have any notion of whether Colbert was a staunch critic of Trump or not, because I don't watch his content. So after all is a weird thing to see here. You can see this in other articles on other topics where the writer or the outlet or both kind of assume a shared knowledge of the audience in a strange way. And I highlight it here because I don't think you necessarily have to understand that Colbert is one of the staunchest critics of Trump on television. And so them saying after all is to allude to the fact that it is obvious. And I don't think it is. Colbert alluded to the online worrying about his fate when he returned from vacation on Monday night. He condemned the Paramount settlement on air, likening it to a big fat bribe. And he joked that his new mustache would protect him from the corporation. And then some jokes. CBS, however, said in a statement, this is a purely financial decision against a challenging backdrop in late night. It is not related in any way to the show's performance, content, or other matters happening at Paramount. Well, it isn't related to the show's performance in so far as if it were quintuple as popular, presumably the advertisers would pay more. But this is a corporate type statement to say, look, it doesn't have anything to do with anything else. It's just dollars and cents. We haven't been running a good company for many, many years. That's why we're selling out to Skydance. And here we are. The corporate financial pressures are real. Paramount laid off another 3.5% of its workforce just last month. So to CNN's credit here, they have given you all the background information to suggest that CBS and Paramount are being upright citizens, that they are telling you the truth about why they did this thing. But that's not where this article ends. We have an advertisement, and then we have more commentary. Due to plunging ad revenue, The Late Show is no longer profitable, according to a source close to the network. There's your anonymous sources. You get this with the corporate reporting a lot. Still, the Colbert News was head spinning in the TV world, as evidenced by the heartbroken reactions from fans. Where? On the show's Instagram page. One of the most favorited comments said, This is crazy. Now, this is the kind of thing that in reporting like this bugs the heck out of me, right? So, okay, CBS says it's a financial decision, but we want to establish that this is a crazy decision. We want to show that this is outside the norm because we have a concept here in our article that we will get to as we go on that says this is because of President Trump. And so we're going to need to backstop that this is crazy. Where are we going to get our backstop? We're going to get it from social media, from the fans of the show on its own Instagram page. Yes, I can promise you that if you look at any cancellation and you go to the fan social media portals, that you are going to be able to find some people saying this is the most stupid thing ever, right? Go find any one season show on Netflix, find their Reddit, find their Twitter account, find their shipping account for the main love interest in the show, and you will see these kind of commentary on everything. That is not something that is head spinning in the TV world, but that's all the evidence they use for that assertion in this sentence. And that's the kind of thing that happens a lot, but it is notable because they are leading into what is going to amount to a pretty massive political conspiracy as part of this entire story. Next year will be our last season, Colbert said. The network will be ending our show in May. It's the end of the Late Show on CBS. This is all just going away. Some observers immediately raised concerns about Paramount's motivation, including Democratic Senator Adam Schiff, who happened to be Colbert's guest on Thursday. Just finished taping with Stephen Colbert, who announced his show was canceled, Schiff wrote on X, formerly Twitter. If Paramount and CBS ended the Late Show for political reasons, the public deserves to know, and deserves better. Now, look, this is out of pocket as a statement, right? But I give a lot more leniency to politicians saying this kind of thing. That's their job, is to go and politic all over the place, right? I don't love that. Politician is not my favorite job in the world. It's not my favorite type of person in the world. But the politician going out there and saying, hey, if this was canceled for political reasons, we need to know, we need more transparency, is not anything that I think deserves intense scrutiny or negative kind of analysis there. That is normal for politicians to do. I do want to say that the folks at CBS have been great partners, Colbert said. It's the end of an era, says this article. Trump's election in 2016 changed the trajectory of Colbert's version of The Late Show. Colbert broke out from the late night pack as his harsh criticism of Trump galvanized viewers, giving CBS its biggest late night ratings victory in 2 decades. Now, that's a story they're telling here, basically an assertion without evidence. None of the rest of this article kind of goes into exactly how that happened or whether it's true or not, but we will take it as true for purposes of this article because, and this is the real reason Hangouts and Headlines is so important, I think, nobody has the time, effort, or inclination to go and check every single sentence that you put into an article like this. But I can note for you all that this is just a raw assertion that assumes that you already agree with this statement of the reality of the situation. Whether or not it is true is something that would take a lot more research to do as part of reading a relatively toss-away article from a few days ago. The network previously ended James Corden's Late Late Show in 2023. At the time, executives said that the 12:35 a.m. show had become unprofitable for CBS. As I said, CBS, Paramount overall, in financial straits. That's why they're merging. That's why they're selling out the company in the first place. And so, again, this is another instance of the article doing a decent enough job establishing that CBS is adamant that this is a financial decision. They do it at the beginning and the end. But the middle section of this article is strongly suggestive of something else going on, and we'll see how they double down on that in an article that came out just after. Colbert helped produce a much less expensive show, After Midnight. That show ended earlier this year, but CBS said it wrapped because the host, Taylor Tomlinson, who Mrs. Hoeg loves, by the way, did not want to helm another season, not because of financial considerations. Bill Carter, the author of 2 best-selling books about the late night wars, said Thursday night that the financial side of that business has definitely been under pressure. But if CBS believes it can escape without some serious questions about capitulating to Trump, they are seriously deluded. And so this is the same kind of format that you see in the rest of the article that says, okay, everybody says it's financial. There's good reason to believe it is financial, but questions abound, right? This is the experts say kind of concept within journalism. It's something that really bugs me. You can see it in a lot of forms and formats in the space, but you can see CNN doesn't want to let this go. They want to report on this as potentially more than just a financial decision, and they kind of do that throughout the article. And then we get to a few weeks before that, talking about the settlement itself. So I wanted to bring up this settlement because I think it's an important point as to why this story doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and I don't think it should make sense to you at the end of the day. And that is what this settlement was about. So if you don't know anything about this story, broad strokes, 60 Minutes, one of the CBS News shows that's on, I think most prominently that I know of after like football, that's when I see it most often, is accused by President Trump of editing an interview that Kamala Harris gave as part of the election period of time and editing it to make her look better. And Trump sued for that editing. There were various conversations about whether or not that was something that would survive First Amendment scrutiny, that CBS News has the ability to have their First Amendment editorial control over what they put out there in the world. And in all honesty, I think it was a pretty weak lawsuit. I think that there are places in electioneering law that kind of rub against the First Amendment in the wrong way. And I think that this was one of those areas where President Trump and his administration was kind of trying to push against a news organization in a way that probably was not going to bear fruit on the long term. And you see that represented in this article. It is odd to call this a settlement when the result is so unsettling. Veteran journalism professor Al Tompkins remarked, there is great fear about what comes next, a CBS News staffer told CNN. His bullying tactics, in reference to President Trump from CNN Business here, says, we'll continue to challenge media companies for the foreseeable future. Behavior that gets rewarded gets repeated, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression said Wednesday. And as a full disclaimer, that's Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression is FIRE. They are a First Amendment advocacy group that I do follow and I get news press releases from on a regular basis. To their credit, one of the reasons I follow them is because they defend the First Amendment from really both directions. They will defend right-leaning speakers, they will defend left-leaning speakers, they will defend everything in between, including those that are really seen as bad actors in society. And one of the things I say in this space, in virtual legality and others, is that the First Amendment, those rights to get out of government persecution, are really the most important for the people that society hates the most, right? When you're defending First Amendment issues, when you're defending these things, for the most part, you're going to have a large group of people say those people shouldn't be speaking anyway. That terribly controversial thing they said shouldn't be allowed in polite society. It's very important to have advocacy groups out there saying, no, if we're going to defend the First Amendment at all, it starts with defending the worst of us to say these things and to understand what the values of freedom of speech actually means. I know I have a lot of European people that watch these shows in my channel, so I know that the First Amendment and freedom of speech in the United States is not necessarily the same across these various other jurisdictions, especially in Europe. But this is an area where I'm pretty adamant on the importance of being able to freely speak and not be thrown in jail or otherwise something worse by the government forces that control your jurisdiction. And so this is one of those areas where I want to disclose that I do follow FIRE. And so this quote, I think, makes sense in this context. When Trump first sued CBS last fall, Rebecca Tushnet, the Frank Stanton Professor of First Amendment Law at Harvard Law School — I love the titles that are given to professors at schools, right? — told CNN the suit was ridiculous junk and should be mocked. Tushnet, whose professional home is under multifaceted assault by the Trump administration — so, okay, there's a lot of editorializing there, right? Obviously, the Trump administration has applied certain pressure to, among other bodies, the universities of the United States. But I'm not sure that's a multifaceted assault. Assault's a pretty strong word for what amounts to mean tweets and executive orders. The individual incentive in a budding authoritarian state is always to capitulate. That's the point of imposing costs on speech, she said. It's disappointing that so many of our institutions are folding, especially when individual citizens can see very clearly the dangers of this path. Some CBS staffers have expressed similar views. The bribery allegation stems from the fact that Paramount is trying to get the Trump administration to approve its pending merger with Skydance Media. Paramount insists the settlement is not related to the FCC merger review process. Now, this is an area that I wanted to flag for you all because I wanted to flag that I'm not perfect, right? A lot of people think that I'm pretty good at this, and I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you all being here to listen to me talk about these things. But when I first saw these references to the United States approving the merger, one of the knee-jerk reactions that I have, that you've seen me have in other reporting on things like the Microsoft mergers that we've talked about in virtual legality, is that the U.S. does not approve mergers. And so I looked at these kind of references, and there's another reference in the other article that we'll talk about, saying, okay, this is another area where the journalists are getting something legal slightly wrong. But that's not, in fact, the case here. And this is another important kind of thing that I want to talk about when we go over these articles, is that it's always important to second-guess yourself as well as the writer and the article and what's being presented to you as the reality out there in the world. And that is to say, the FCC merger review process is slightly different from the generalized antitrust merger review process. So Under the Sherman Act, under the Clayton Act that we've talked about in the past, the antitrust regulatory authorities are really just looking at whether or not something substantially lessens competition. And if they don't say anything at all, the merger can go through. But in the case of somebody that has an FCC license, a license to broadcast things using the radio waves of the United States, then the Communications Act of, I think, 1934 actually has specific language that says that the FCC has to approve of the deal, that it is in the public interest. And we'll look at some of the FCC language about that when we get there. And I want to talk about that with respect to this whole President Trump is going to stop the merger if you don't do these kinds of things for him kind of notion. But it is important to note that because of the special license that the United States grants to broadcasters, that there is a more active approval process in the United States, one that mirrors a little bit more of the European approval process, where you actually have to go and get your sovereign's permission to buy this company, to get that FCC license transferred as part of a purchase. And you wouldn't be as interested in CBS if they didn't have the right to broadcast on the United States airwaves. So it's fundamental to the merger in and of itself. A monument to Paramount's surrender, says CNN Business. According to the terms of the settlement, which were announced late Tuesday night, and again, this is at the start of June, Trump will drop the suit in exchange for $16 million towards his presidential library. The financial terms mirror the deal that Disney's ABC struck with Trump last December. And if you want to sit here and say, look, he's out there bullying these various organizations and going and getting extractions to fund his library or his monuments to failure or whatever else you want to call these things in your headlines, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that that's wrong. What I do want to talk about as part of this conversation is the power given to the executive agencies, the power given to the executive branch and the FCC in their statutes, and whether or not that's something that we should be looking at as part of this entire conversation. The supposed wrongdoing in this case was just an edit on a 60 Minutes interview with then Vice President Kamala Harris last fall. Now, Just is doing some work here, again, editorializing as part of this article. They want to communicate that this lawsuit was not very significant, was not important. It was just about an edit. And I think I described it very similarly myself earlier when I was summarizing the lawsuit. But when you're reporting on these things, I do think it's important to avoid these kinds of subtle instructions as to how you should feel about this particular subject. Trump seized on the clunky editing, right? Not intentionally disruptive, not anything specifically illegal, but clunky, of one particular question and answer. But TV networks edit interviews all the time, and those editorial decisions are protected under the First Amendment. Indeed, editorial decisions are protected under the First Amendment, but then they rub against those electioneering laws that we talked about before, and that's an open question as to whether or not these things violate those. And when we talk about settlements, one of the things I try to communicate to people and my clients, honestly, all the time, is that you settle when you think it's more expensive or more of a hassle to proceed with a legal a legal process, let's back that up a bit, than it is to just settle for whatever the amount would be. And is that right? Is that something that we should be in favor of? That the legal process can be so expensive that you can essentially extract large amounts of money from someone just by making their day miserable? I would say we shouldn't. And if we could streamline the legal process to get lawyers paid less and to have the entire system take less time and make it less of a hassle, I would be entirely in favor of it. I will tell you, some of my colleagues in the bar, other lawyers across the United States in various states, not as in favor of lowering the price that lawyers can charge or of making the justice system more accessible. That's just the reality of the situation. I fought against that. I have lost in my home state of Michigan. So it is a constant conversation point for me and for my state bar. But as it stands right now, there are a lot of instances where you go, you throw a lawsuit in, it's not completely frivolous, you've got at least a possible chance of winning, and the other side can say, well, this is too much of a hassle for us to deal with. And if the other side is the sitting president of the United States, it's easy enough for me to see that a board or the general counsel for a company like Paramount might sit there and say, it's just better for us to settle for whatever small amount of money $16 million actually represents. It's a fraction of what we spend on things like the Late Show with Stephen Colbert, for instance. And so we will do that. But it's also okay for people to say that sets a bad precedent. Unfortunately, the way settlements work, you're not in charge of the precedent if you're not the one asking to be paid the money or asking to pay the money. So if it makes sense for the two parties involved, it's not really up to you as to what kind of precedent it says. And it's not legal precedent, by the way. It's not anything that the courts can look at and say, oh, that means something that this was settled. It's just the precedent of if someone goes and puts this lawsuit out there, then these networks will capitulate or otherwise surrender $16 million for the building of a presidential library. And we don't necessarily want that to be the state of the world that we live in. So there's a lot of back and forth on these particular topics, but this CNN article is entirely premised around the fact that there was no chance that Paramount could lose this case. There's never no chance that anybody could lose a case, by the way. There's always some chance that a judge or a jury is going to go in a weird direction and you're going to be left holding the bag. And so lawyers, board members are always looking at it and saying, okay, well, what does this actually cost us? What would it cost us to pay the lawyers to run this through? What are the chances of success? And at certain amounts of liability, of exposure, if you've got a 5% chance of losing, it still makes sense to settle if the amount of money the other side is asking for, is low enough. And I think that's what happened here. I think that's what's happening here. And you can argue, again, that President Trump and his administration are playing bully ball with lawsuits and the cost of doing litigation as it stands. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. You can leave that comment in the comments if you're so inclined. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a grander conspiracy afoot. So then CNN reports a little bit on a New York Post article reporting a side deal between Ellison of Skydance, who wants to purchase Paramount, and Trump, involving TV airtime for public service announcements promoting Trump-aligned causes. And that would be a weird extraction from the FCC and the Trump administration. That would certainly start to look more like Godfather mafia behavior. But CNN then follows that assertion immediately with a quote that says Paramount has no knowledge of any promises or commitments made to President Trump other than those set forth in the settlement proposed by the mediator and accepted by the parties. A spokesperson for Ellison, remember, this is the company that wants to buy Paramount, had no comment on the matter, and there is no evidence of any such deal. You'd think that would be the end of it, but it's important for CNN to get these paragraphs in there. But the report only intensified questions about CBS News, inside CBS News, about how Ellison might approach owning the news division in the future. So again, this is a rhetorical device, a playbook that I have seen in a number of places. I see it in this CNN article. We'll see it again in the one that I'm really interested in just a second. That says, okay, everybody important says there's nothing here, but questions abound, right? People are still asking questions, intensified questions, despite everybody saying that this doesn't exist. While journalists at 60 Minutes and across CBS News are concerned, they ultimately want to move on and continue doing their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. There's not much else there to pull from this particular article. That's the lay of the land. That is the background for the Stephen Colbert cancellation. And then when we arrive at the article that I put in the thumbnail to this video, inside CBS's agonizing decision to cancel Colbert's top-rated late-night show, we see a similar rhetorical device used, and it's really what jumped out to me. As I mentioned when we were talking about the auto pen last week, that I read these articles, and if I see a particular rhetorical flourish that really rubs me the wrong way, I want to bring it to your attention because I think that's an important part of discussing how these headlines and articles are written. From the outside, the idea made no sense at all. Why would a broadcast network cancel one of its best shows that ranks #1 in its time slot? One of its best known shows that ranks #1 in its time slot. And again, we already talked about the numbers here, but this seems to be a specific phrasing that makes you think that it doesn't make any sense, that it's crazy. It's the oddest decision. It could only be done for some kind of conspiratorial reason. And yet, being ranked #1 in your time slot, being best known, doesn't actually pay the bills, right? There are times when the shows that I make on this channel do really well, when people are coming in, when subscribers are being added, and the advertising revenue goes down. There are different forces in play at just this channel, let alone a organization the size of Paramount. And so the phraseology here is designed to obfuscate, right? From moment one, the idea made no sense at all from the outside isn't true. Anybody that follows television or media at all says, okay, the days of the late night talk show are probably numbered. Movies aren't making as much money. Movie stars aren't making as much money. The people that you're anymore, the advertising dollars are down. They're expensive to produce as compared to things like the news every night. And so you would expect these folks to be on the chopping block without a grand conspiracy, without a merger pending, or these other things you want to mention. Why would a broadcast network cancel one of its best known shows? Because they are running out of money. But on the inside at CBS, there were several plausible answers to that question. Not true answers, plausible answers. Okay, we're doing work already, CNN. While the Late Show host Stephen Colbert was on his usual midsummer vacation earlier this month, CBS executives weighed the pros and cons of canceling the unique but unfortunately unprofitable show. Okay, so you're admitting it's unprofitable here. We don't, again, have that actually established in the article, but you're claiming it here. It seems to be the case. The cons were obvious, as evidenced by the studio audience's boos when Colbert announced the cancellation on Thursday night. The cons presumably meaning that you're going to lose some street cred or some audience, but that's not at all evidenced by what the studio audience to the show does, right? This is the same as looking at the Instagram fans of the show and saying, this is crazy. The people that got tickets or stood in line or however else you get into the Late Show taping of Stephen Colbert are obviously going to be disappointed when Stephen Colbert stands in front of them and says, my show was just canceled. And so that doesn't really suggest anything of import about this overall, but you can see the framework already just in the way this article is written. It's a crazy idea. Inside, there were several plausible answers that why this might have happened, including that the audience would be upset. However, the pros ultimately won out because according to sources close to the network, there's your anonymous sources again, keep those in mind, the Late Show was losing money and there was no apparent path to turning around its financial position. There are other articles out there that you can find, again, if you're researching this topic, that show that it was potentially losing a lot of money. It was an agonizing decision, as the executives admitted in a statement. But CBS insiders insist, even when speaking frankly on condition of anonymity, that the move was financially driven, not politically motivated. Okay, so this is actually the paragraph that starts flagging for me that I'm going to make a Hangouts and Headlines about this. And it becomes even more so when the next paragraph is, many observers have huge doubts about that, given that Colbert has been an outspoken critic of President Trump. Now, I think it's important here to take a step back and understand what the role of the journalist is, right? What a journalist is supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be communicating truth. When you're looking at an article like this one, they're supposed to be telling you what actually happened so that you can decide for yourself what's going on. But here, we've got a paragraph where CNN Business here says, CBS insiders insist, even when speaking frankly on condition of anonymity, that the move was financially driven. So we offered them that they can be anonymous. We're not going to have them risk their jobs or anything like that. And yet they still say it's politically motivated. And in fact, they use the word here in describing it as insist, right? The reading of that bit of language is that it's a pleading. It's almost against the obvious reality of the situation, right? Whatever the connotation is that you want to ascribe, insist has a different tone than CBS insiders stay or CBS insiders claim, and all of these various options that were available to you in the English language to not imply that they're essentially lying about this. And then even though they've got this offer of anonymity, they're unwilling to go on the record as saying that it was politically motivated. But many observers have huge doubts about that. And we saw the word observers before. We saw them use the word observers to refer to Adam Schiff, who was on the show, as someone that thought that this might be a political kind of stance. But again, the article here is we can't get anybody at CBS or Paramount to even talk about this, even if they're anonymous. Excuse me. But that's not good enough for our story. We're going to continue on by saying, but other people who don't have any personal information about any of this have their doubts. Okay, well, that's not a news item, right? Everybody everywhere can find someone that has doubts about any story that you put out there in any capacity. Anybody anywhere can find an expert that says what they want them to say on any legal case or any other type of case. I think you've seen that if you follow my colleagues on YouTube. If you watch any of these big name cases, you can see that there are people. The human race is a large and diverse group, both in race and in thought and in, quite frankly, capability. And so you can find many observers that have huge doubts or that are certain about anything. And that doesn't really answer the question of whether or not this is a news story. So I wanted to point that out. This is what jumped out at me when I saw CNN's reporting on this, because I immediately say, okay, that's a rhetorical fake out. That's a hand wave. Let's see if they've got anything more to hang their hat on. The Writers Guild of America, which represents writers on The Late Show, said Friday that it is concerned the cancellation was a bribe to curry favor with the Trump administration. The Guild wants the New York State Attorney General to launch an investigation. And this concept, which we'll see kind of repeated in the article, is the one that I wanted to flag as being so interesting as compared to the settlement article that they wrote at the top of this last month, right? So the issue with the settlement is that They've got a lot of lawyers and a lot of First Amendment advocates out there saying that this wasn't a very strong lawsuit and that 60 Minutes and CBS has full editorial control and editorial rights to edit their interviews however they like, and that this was going to be a loser. And so it's interesting to me that the framework of this article about the Stephen Colbert cancellation is that the editorial decision by CBS and Paramount to cancel this show is what needs to be questioned, and that attorney generals need to launch an investigation about it, right? If your concern is that the president of the United States of America is applying pressure, and he did it with a forced litigation and a settlement on the 60 Minutes lawsuit and is continuing to apply pressure that forced the cancellation of Stephen Colbert, then you're either going to have to defend editorial control in both instances or neither. But CNN takes the opposite tack. They say, okay, it's a big issue that CBS decided to edit this. It's a big issue that CBS decided to cancel Stephen Colbert, but it's not a big issue that CBS decided to edit their interviews in the ways that they saw fit. To my mind, as a lawyer looking at this question, it's a really strange combination of materials, and especially strange when you see as part of this article that the way you get into President Trump conspiracy territory is by applying the logic of the settlement with 60 Minutes and CBS News to the fact that Trump is playing bully ball and doing all these various things that Paramount is trying to accede to. So as we continue this article, just keep that in mind, that those two particular points on the political spectrum of the arguments that are being made in this article are basically mutually exclusive. They are directly contradictory. That if it's a problem that President Trump is arguing against the editorial control of CBS in the case of 60 Minutes, it can't be a problem that CBS is exercising editorial control in the cancellation of its television show. Late night TV's unfortunate reality. The bottom has indeed been falling out of the late night TV business model for several years now. One insider described it as cratering at CBS. So we know that insiders on anonymous sourcing are willing to say things like late night is cratering at the station. They're unwilling to say there was a political motivation to anything, but they are willing to say really bad things about their parent company and employer. That's because even though Colbert outrated his competition at 11:35, the overall audience for late night has been shrinking, right? And that was the obvious kind of assumption that you could make based on they're saying it's for financial reasons, and CNN is putting out there that it's still the number one ranked show in the time slot. It's like, okay, well, the pie must have shrunk significantly if that's at all true, right? And we see that here. Ad dollars and audiences are moving away from late night shows, Variety reported, and that was way back in 2023. The financial picture has only gotten gloomier since then. Guideline, an ad data firm, estimates that the network's late night shows earned $439 million in ad revenue in 2018 and only $220 million in 2024, a decline of 50% in a very short time in an inflationary economy. These shows hosted by Colbert and his rivals Jimmy Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel are inherently expensive to produce, with hundreds of staffers and elaborate studio productions. And this is to CNN's credit here, that they're putting all this financial information again out there. The shows are also an awkward fit on streaming platforms since they tend to be topical, limiting the shelf life of the content. Hello, Hangouts and Headlines. Colbert's commentaries and interviews often go viral on social media. I don't think I have seen a Colbert commentary or interview on my social media timeline in a long, long time, and I'm unclear exactly what the journalistic definition of viral is, but that attention isn't easily converted into cold, hard cash since CBS doesn't control the social platforms. Okay, they're a broadcast network. They could create a social platform if they were so inclined. But couldn't CBS have explored changes to the cost structure? Again, what are we doing here in this article, right? Yes, they could have done different things. Why is that indicative of a crazy decision to cancel the show? That's what the network did later in the evening in its 12:35 a.m. time slot in 2023. The Late Late Show with James Corden ended, partly due to the fact that it was no longer making money for CBS, and a cheaper show called After Midnight, we saw referenced earlier. Colbert was an executive producer on both After Midnight and The Late Show, so he had some visibility into the financial circumstances. But the swiftness of the network's decision suggests that he wasn't given much time to suggest cost savings or other alternatives. Is it a casualty of the merger? Asks CNN Business. That's why one person close to Colbert described the show's retirement, effective in May 2026, as a casualty of the merger. Now, to be clear, this is not talking about getting the merger approved by the FCC or the Trump administration. This specifically, this quote, is talking about in a merger context, one of the things that the company that he's getting bought often does is start cleaning up its books and records, start cleaning up what might be extraneous costs, extra people, redundancies, whatever it might be, for the merger to be as clean as possible. That merger is CBS parent Paramount's long gestating deal with Skydance, a media company controlled by David Ellison, son of Oracle billionaire Larry Ellison. The elder Ellison is a longtime friend of President Trump, that's Larry, not David, and has previously described himself as a Trump supporter. And David Ellison was spotted with the president earlier this year at UFC matches. Okay. The pending deal matters for two reasons. One, because companies almost always try to cut costs around the time of a merger. It seems pretty important. And two, because the deal requires sign-off from the Trump administration. This was the sentence where I indicated earlier that I flagged this as potentially wrongly describing how a merger is approved in the United States, but that is not in fact the case for an FCC merger, so we'll talk about that in just a minute. Paramount entered into a settlement agreement with Trump earlier this month to resolve Trump's lawsuit against the CBS News program 60 Minutes. The company said it would pay $16 million towards Trump's future presidential library. Trump suggested at the time that there were other components to the settlement. And I think that's all I wanted to flag from this main article. But the biggest item there is this concept of saying CBS, there's nobody at CBS that will say this was politically motivated. Even our sources with anonymous control of what they give to us that will not jeopardize their jobs, but that other people say that there are concerns. And that's what we reported on more than anything else. That's why this is the Hangouts and Headlines. And on that topic, I do want to give credit to the folks that say, okay, but Trump is a bully and he does these various things against these institutions. That's undoubtedly the case, right? Trump says, I absolutely love that Stephen Colbert got fired, and I hear Jimmy Kimmel is next, right? He does himself no favors on these scores. I absolutely love that Colbert got fired. His talent was even less than his ratings. I hear Jimmy Kimmel is next. He has even less talent than Colbert. President Trump is clearly gloating over this. Does that mean that he instigated it or asked for it? No. And when we talk about how these things can potentially go down, we saw, as a for instance, in the Microsoft Activision transaction, that these companies do try to placate the authorities that have jurisdictional control over whatever transaction they are trying to do. So it could be the case that as part of conversations within CBS or Paramount, they said it would just be better if this guy weren't on our airwaves, that we weren't putting out there, and the president might be happy about it. The president clearly is happy about it, but that doesn't equal Godfather President Trump sitting there and saying, I've got an offer that you can't refuse. The president then went on to praise Fox News late night comedian Greg Gutfeld, who Trump said is better than all of them combined, including the moron on NBC, who ruined the once great Tonight Show, referring to Jimmy Fallon. Is he? Could be Jay Leno. I don't know. Who is the moron on NBC who ruined the once great Tonight Show? There's a number of possibilities to that. Then we have more here. Just taking a stab at it, Colbert joked that he'd take $16 million to assuage his concerns about the cancellation of the show, indicating that the Paramount lawsuit settlement is part of this whole thing. And obviously, reasonable minds can differ on all of that. But what's important to me when we talk about these topics is not that we can know from 30,000 feet and outside all of these rooms exactly what happened, but that the journalists that have these sources that can talk about these things don't make these big leaps in understanding that require us to believe in conspiracy theories or what have you. The Independent report, Stephen Colbert tells Trump to go F himself as he warns that the gloves are off after cancellation. Stephen Colbert had a very blunt message for Donald Trump after the president celebrated his cancellation. In his Monday monologue, Colbert brought up a Truth Social post that we just discussed in Variety. Responding to the post, Colbert said, "How dare you, sir? Would an untalented man be able to compose the following satirical witticism?" And looking into the eloquence cam, then did not pull his punches, telling the president to go F yourself. So, yes, I have to say, as someone that doesn't love the language here, I don't find that to be a terribly humorous interlude in the show, but it could have been presented well in context. Either way, it's totally fair for somebody with a platform like The Late Show or otherwise to say this is unacceptable and it's not good to be gloating over my failures or the failures of my company. So I understand that. But getting back to the media's presentation of all these matters, the one thing I wanted to flag was that the journalistic job is not to make these assumptions, right? And I've pulled up this New York Times discussion of Superman, the movie, just because I wanted to remind myself that there's a section in this movie in which Lois Lane, the reporter at the Daily Planet, fictional newspaper, is interviewing Superman, Clark Kent. I know spoilers, but one of the things that he says is, well, don't you know that country X that invaded country Y is a bad country, that they're evil people, what have you. And she says something that I think is a really good, insightful sentence that I would really have everybody learn that is reporting on these things, which is, she says, I think it's almost certain that they are, but do I know it? No. And I'm paraphrasing there because I don't have the movie in front of me, obviously, and it's not going to be spoiled in the New York Times. But that's an important aspect of reporting on these things, right? One of the things that the CNN business articles is doing on these topics is saying, okay, President Trump's a bully. Our audience maybe dislikes him. You know that he does all these various things out there. He otherwise bullied the law schools. He bullied the universities. He's bullied the ABC, now CBS. Does it really take a big leap in logic to assume that he is bullying CBS and Paramount in order to get the people that are making fun of him off the air, and he's doing it with the leverage of approving a merger? No, it doesn't take a big leap to come to that assumption. But that's not the job of the journalist. That's not what these outlets should be doing. They shouldn't be helping people leap to conclusions. They shouldn't be helping people jump to things that they don't know for certain, right? And it's clear that CNN doesn't know this for certain. To their credit, they put the proof directly in the article. They state that the anonymous sources they have in CBS are unwilling to say it was politically motivated, but it sure could look politically motivated, and that's not a healthy way for media to operate, right? I don't often come on here and editorialize about what is happening here as much as I try to just dig deep into seeing what is happening, but it is unacceptable for journalistic outlets of any stripe on things that are important or otherwise to come out here and say, okay, all the proof we can muster says this didn't happen, but it sure looks suspicious, doesn't it? It's like, fine, yes, I can come to that conclusion on my own, Mr. Article Writer, but it is not your job, and no, you don't know for certain. In fact, you have good proof of the opposite. So let us make our own conclusions on these things, and honestly, be more circumspect about how you use the power of the ink and the pen that are at your disposal. Be more respectful of the giant platforms you have at places like CNN or other major outlets to not jump in and say, it's obvious what happened here, even if we don't have proof of it. Because down that road leads very, very bad things. And we assume a lot of things about other people, about institutions and the like. And that's really where prejudice and other bad things comes from, is making those assumptions when we don't really have any reason to. And that's what I wanted to talk to you all about here. I wanted to frame it as part of this Superman conversation because I really like that movie and I highly recommend it. But one of the things that I really focused on when I watched this last time was in that moment where Lois Lane says, do I think it's almost certain? I do. But do I have any proof? No, I don't. And that's an important distinction. That sounds like just nuance or angels on the head of a pin or a lawyer being legalese, but it's not. Knowing that you think something is almost certainly true or right or probably happened is different from what you actually know. And journalists have a duty to the people that read their work, that watch their work or otherwise, to be more careful with that jumping to conclusions, Matt, that you see online. And unfortunately, I think a lot of our media peers don't take that responsibility seriously, and I would have them take it much more seriously. So yes, check out Superman. Highly recommend it. Good time. Old-timey summer blockbuster. Just a lot of fun for the family. But if you take nothing else away from it, Lois Lane has one of my favorite kind of commentaries on what a journalist should be doing in reporting on what they know and what they don't know in that movie. So good for you, James Gunn, the writer of that movie. Really appreciated that. Really liked that. I wish more people in reality that have the power of the ink and the pen actually thought that. And it's clear that the CNN article writer in this case doesn't think that, and I would have them think it. But that said, with all that done, we got to talk a little law, right? Because I'm a lawyer here. We got to talk about what the FCC can actually do. I said I made a mistake or would have made a mistake when I jumped to my own conclusions when I thought, oh, this is being reported wrong. And I then researched a little bit more about what the FCC does in the merger review process. And we're going to talk about it right now because it's a very broad ambit that Congress has given the United States Federal Communications Commission to decide on when it approves of a deal. And I want to talk about why that's a potential problem if you've got an issue with President Trump or any other president and the executive body in and of itself. So let's take a look at how the FCC describes its purview. Congress has charged the FCC with initially assigning licenses and authorizations under the Communications Act. For example, broadcast radio and television licenses, licenses used by wireless companies, satellite authorizations, and authorizations to provide landline telephone service. Now, I want to tell you, I looked at the Communications Act of 1934 because I like to use primary source material and I like to bring it up for you all when we have these conversations. It is written like a statute from 1934, as you would expect, but it's not very easy to understand. It's not very easy to parse. And honestly, it is way out of date for how communications infrastructure works in 2025 and really probably should be looked at by Congress. It's not right that our legislative body in the United States has not really looked at how information is transmitted across communications lines since the 1930s. And it talks a lot about radio waves and a lot of broadcast things that don't really apply to the way most people would even get any of their communications, let alone their news communications, in the 21st century. That said, Congress also requires that the FCC approve any time one of those licenses or authorizations is assigned to another person or control of the company holding the license or authorization is transferred. So breaking down this legalese a little bit, you've got a special government permit to broadcast things through radio waves, the over-the-air television channels, the broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS in the United States. And because you have this special permit, if someone wants to buy you, we can say whether that permit can be transferred. That's all within the ambit of governmental authority. That's all normal. But it means that the FCC can take a more specialized interest in a merger or transaction than just the general antitrust control of something like the FTC or the DOJ, which we saw in operation with respect to Microsoft and Activision, as a for instance. In plain terms, the FCC must approve every time a license changes hands. As a practical matter, then, the FCC reviews every merger involving a telecommunications company. The standards for the FCC's review have also been set by Congress, one would hope, both in making the initial assignment and in reviewing the transfer of any license. The FCC must determine whether the public interest, convenience, and necessity would be served by granting the application. Okay, so as a kind of textualist lawyer that likes things in black and white, in the statutes, in the contract terms, this is the kind of language that makes me throw up a little. This is the kind of language that makes my heart burn when you give an executive agency the authority, in fact, the ambit, to go and say, we get to decide when something is in the public interest without a defined term or other kind of contours around what that means. What you are granting, and this is the Congress of 1934, not any contemporaries of ours, is that executive agency the authority to basically say no and to extract whatever it is that they want out of that transaction process. So in the history of the FCC, one of the things we see is that basically every merger, every acquisition is ultimately approved, but that the FCC winds up extracting what they call concessions from the companies to do various things in order so that the merger or acquisition is qualifying for in the public interest in their eyes. But it means that they're kind of de facto quasi policy-making agencies as part of the merger review process in a way that the FTC and the DOJ never get a chance to under the Sherman and Clayton Acts. Unlike other parts of the federal government, the FCC examines not only whether competition would be harmed by approving the license transfer, but also whether it would be enhanced. In addition, the FCC examines the likely effects of the transfer on the private sector deployment of advanced services, the diversity of license holders, and the diversity of information sources and services available to the public. And in that sentence, they mostly mean diversity of thought, diversity of information sources, not diversity of race. But you can read that in any specific way that you want to read it for policy purposes. And that's the overview of what the FCC does. So the FTC and the DOJ, they look to see if when Microsoft buys Activision, is there a substantial lessening of competition in these various sectors of the economy. In the case of the FCC, they look to say, okay, if Skydance buys Paramount, is that in the quote-unquote public interest? What does that mean? Well, for the most part, that's up to the FCC. And if it is lessening competition or something else that might be against the public interest, can we otherwise make up for it by giving the FCC something that it wants? That's the way that this thing works historically. And it's one thing that the FCC is a little bit sensitive to. So we go further in the FCC's documentation here. We see them talking about their merger powers. Before a company may assign an FCC license to another company, it must receive the commission's approval. The commission reviews applications for the transfer of control and assignment of licenses and authorizations to ensure that the public interest would be served by approving the applications. The vast majority are processed quickly. Some transactions, however, present more complex issues and take a lot more time and potentially require public comment, requiring more extensive commission review. And so the FCC is out there saying, look, like most things that the government deals with, 90% of them happen really fast. But the 10% that don't happen fast, those are the public ones. Those are the very highly reported ones, and they do take a longer time. Obviously, once an executive branch agency like the FCC has this authority, has this power, then yes, it can be used for nefarious purposes or leveraged against by the executive himself, the President of the United States of America. And so that's one of the things that makes this story pop as much as it does, is that the Communications Act of 1934, regulating radio waves in the 30s, is something that the President of the United States can use to leverage outcomes that he might want from something like Skydance deciding that they want to buy Paramount. So yes, there is the possibility there, there's the space there for a bully, mafioso type president to use the authority granted by Congress to do very bad things. Is that happening here? I can't promise that it is, just like I couldn't tell you whether Biden approved those auto pen signatures when we talked about it last week. But the fact that the situation exists is something that I would see, editorializing myself for a little bit here, corrected by Congress. All right, let's put some guardrails around this. Let's put some contours around what the president can do, what the FCC can do. Public interest is far too broad of a category when we talk about what an agency should actually be looking at in these things. And when we look at the General Counsel's commentary on this specific topic in August of 2014, we see very similar concerns even from them. Our review is prescribed by the Communications Act and is separate from, though complementary to, the analysis conducted by our sister antitrust agencies, the FTC and the DOJ, under Section 7 of the Clayton Act. The starting point of our mission, and therefore our substantive review, the review of the substance of the transaction, is the language of the Communications Act itself. Congress has directed the Commission to review transactions involving licenses and authorizations under the Communications Act and to determine whether the proposed transaction would serve the public interest, convenience, and necessity. The breadth and importance of the public interest standard of the review of transactions involving our nation's communications network logically flows from the Commission's statutory mission, since the conduct of buying other licensees can be as important to the public as the way a licensed company conducts itself in the absence of a transaction. But understand where the hole in the legal logic lies in that particular statement, which is to say, okay, if I can justify our commission's power that way, then I can ask for basically anything in respect of how the resulting entity after the transaction conducts itself under the authority of the public interest standard. So that's the main complaint about the way the FCC works in practice, is to say, okay, if we can go and extract concessions, that's not really a legal process. It doesn't go through the court system. It's anything the other party is willing to do. Then we can extract all sorts of kind of extra legal, extra constitutional commitments from these entities that we otherwise shouldn't be able to, because we can then say that it was in the public interest. This standard complements, but is different from the antitrust agency's standard set forth in Section 7 of the Clayton Act, which instructs them to challenge transactions which would substantially lessen competition. We have broader authority, and they do, right? That is what's in the Communications Act of 1934. I think this is the kind of thing where maybe a President Trump highlights this particular issue for folks at CNN and other outlets, that we can look at this situation and say, okay, that's far too much power for the FCC to have. They shouldn't be able to look at a transaction and say, this license can't change hands unless you buy me a sandwich from the vendor down the street that I like so much, right? And I'm using that as a hyperbolic, ridiculous assertion because the FCC would never ask for that. But if you don't have to have anything related to competition or the merger itself, and you can just ask for things that you think as the commissioner of the FCC would be in the public interest, then you have this broad congressional ambit of authority that you can apply pretty justifiably in your own brain and ask for anything, any concession that you want from these companies. And yes, if you don't like Donald Trump and you say, okay, Donald Trump is the one that's giving instructions to the Republican commissioners on the FCC, then you can say, okay, he could ask for all sorts of things like the firing of Stephen Colbert as part of this quid pro quo. And would that wind up in documentation? No, it wouldn't. Not if anybody was smart anywhere along this entire process. So we don't have evidence of that. CBS refuses to say that that's what happened. But at CNN, we can say, look, the situation is ripe for someone that we think already is ill-tempered and is willing to bully all sorts of institutions to use the powers that the FCC has for this nefarious purpose. And that's the legal side of this particular equation. You can see other kind of summary arguments against these things in various places. This is an American Action Forum post that I pulled up. I will link all of these in the description. You can find on the podcast page for the show. I don't include them on YouTube, which I've mentioned before, because YouTube flags my channel if I include too many links in the description. So I will put that in the podcast page. But this is, as described in their own about page, a center-right institution that would not ostensibly be on the side of a President Trump in this particular course of events, certainly not a President Biden, in 2024, saying there are concerns about the FCC not the least of which include the fact that a double review process of anybody that has a telecommunications license is maybe not the most efficient use of government resources for this purpose. So they're speaking out against Biden and the potential abuse that might happen with the FCC under President Biden. I think CNN and others are speaking about the potential abuse that the FCC process might have under President Trump. I don't think either of them are wrong, but I do think that we need to look at standards like this one and say, okay, public interest, that's pretty broad. Let's put some definitions around this. Let's limit your powers to not just extracting whatever it is that you would choose out of these various things. That's the law side of the equation. So at the end of the day, what we wind up with is the law in the United States has afforded an opportunity for a bully president who was so inclined to use the merger review process of a federal telecommunications license changing hands to potentially extract concessions that advantage him. Is Trump the kind of person that might do that? I think there is ample evidence in the way that he has otherwise issued his executive orders and treated other news organizations and institutions across the United States that he might be the kind of person inclined to do that. Is there any evidence that he did on this score? I think the CNN business article actually suggests that there definitely isn't, right? That's the reason I flagged it for you, is that CBS, even offered anonymous sourcing, says, nope, it's not politically motivated. And yet others say that it is. That's a problem in the country, right? That's a problem, not just with journalists. I highlighted it when I talked about Superman earlier, but it's a problem in the country when you say, okay, if this opportunity exists and I don't trust this guy in the executive office, then I'm just going to build this conspiracy theory for myself that says he must be doing it in this way. I can't look you in the eye and tell you he's not doing that. I can't. Folks, if you're Trump fans in the comments, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that he's not doing that. But I can tell you that there's no evidence that he is, and that the CNN article to the effect that observers think that there might be a chance is not news, right? It's not news that some people doubt President Trump, just like it's not news that some people doubt President Biden on autopens or otherwise. But you don't write like this if you're a journalist, and that's what I wanted to flag for you in Hangouts and Headlines. I hope this was a useful episode on the headlines front. Let's get back to Hangouts, and let me know if you have any questions or comments or anything else I can answer. I think I have some super chats to get to while I was on a roll going through all those articles. So let me see if I can flag those. And we will get to more Hangouts, and I will highlight more comments as we finish up the show. Brentwood Chic says, happy to watch you once a week, once a month, and whenever you can handle. Member for 27 months. Thank you, Brentwood Chic. My intent is to try to get this to about once a week. I can't promise that every week, but that's my goal here. So I appreciate you being here. I hope this commentary on these particular topics was useful. I really think it's important for everybody to get out there into these articles, these news items, and to interrogate them for truth content. Not because everybody's against you, not because the media is awful, but just because human beings, even when they don't mean to, have their own biases and agendas show up when they're reporting on these various things. And the better you can kind of isolate when they are actually asserting something that is evidentiary backed, when they're not just putting their editorial or agenda-based thought process out in front, the better you are going to be and the better understanding of the world you're going to have. So if I can offer any of that here at Hangouts and Headlines, I will try to do that as much as I can, honestly. Thank you for being here. Britt Cormier with the huge super chat. Thank you so much, Britt. I have worked in corp world a long time. Yep. Companies discontinue products that are profitable but had razor-thin margins. Yes, absolutely. Getting rid of a product that was non-profitable and losing popularity is a no-brainer. Number one show or not, profit drives these decisions. Well, the number one show, I think, is a red herring, right? If you're the best-selling terrible product and the market is just things that sell worse than you, but everybody loses money, it doesn't mean you have to continue going with that. And then the fact that you're number one in whatever awful product market you're in doesn't mean that it makes sense to keep going. So I agree with you, Britt. I also agree with you that profitable things that have thin profit margins are cut all the time. One of the things we don't talk about enough is opportunity cost, right? Even if Colbert was making a very small profit, there might be something you could better do with the money that you were spending on that studio, on that support staff. And we saw it just with the recent Microsoft layoffs that I talked about on Defining Duke and in various places online, which is to say Microsoft clearly thinks there's more money. There's a higher chance of return on investment with generative AI. You don't have to agree with them. I think Microsoft is often run a little bit crazily for one of the biggest tech companies in the world. You don't have to agree with anything that they do to say they can see that this dollar that maybe even makes $4 back might be better spent if it made $20 back. That the opportunity cost is what they're actually evaluating, not just what it makes in the most recent quarter that we might be looking at. And journalists of all stripes and people that comment on these things, not just in the journalism sphere, get that one wrong a lot. So thank you for the super chat, Britt. I think you're exactly right, and I very much appreciate your support of the channel. All right, Dad coming back again. Legacy media has no interest in facts or truth anymore. Legacy News is the worst offender. As a former, long ago, public defender, he's really not overselling how long ago that was. Objecting to assuming facts not in evidence was critical to obtaining a fair result. Too bad. Yeah, there's a lot of assertions that we see in Hangouts and Headlines, and even in Virtual Legality, to be frank, that are without evidence, that you have to point out and say, okay, so you're making this claim, but you're not otherwise backing it up. That's part of what we do here when we critically read these things. Unfortunately, it's the case that we have to do it more often than I would like. But honestly, if it appears in Hangouts and Headlines, chances are I have some major issue with it. So we are kind of controlling for what the group of articles there are that we look at. Hero and Tragedy, the way the media reports the story is why they deserve to be sued. It's manipulative. In terms of the 60 Minutes editing story, look, I do not think there was a 0% chance that President Trump would win on that. That I think that the electioneering stuff and the manipulation within election contexts might well have won the day there. And it certainly would have been controversial enough to have a lot of news items happen at the same time that was proceeding through a litigation. So a well-intentioned lawyer, general counsel, president, CEO, board member at Paramount could just say this is going to be much more hassle than it's worth. And so I think the settlement is not as obvious a bribe, is not as obvious a capitulation as some of the reporting in CNN would suggest. Whether or not they deserve to be sued is going to be a reasonable minds can differ kind of situation. But I think if you look at the transcript and the way that it was edited, there are certainly reasons to believe that maybe CBS News was trying to gloss nominee Harris a little bit more than you would anticipate from a normal editing process. Blue Griff, what are your thoughts on the impact on abolishment of the fairness doctrine back in 1987 for today's MSM biased narratives? The rationale was that it was no longer necessary, of course, pre-social media. I am personally uncomfortable with the notion that anybody that is putting out any kind of editorial content would have to platform content that was anathema to their own belief system, right? So I think there are reasons to think it's a good idea from just the notions of neutral fairness. I don't think it's a good idea from notions of First Amendment or private property kind of concepts. The New York Times should not be obligated to platform somebody that's exactly against what they think is good for the country, good for New York or otherwise, and that I want people that are investing in companies or newspapers or social media enterprises to have the ability to editorially control what it is that they publish and put out there. Does that mean that you get bad actors that are biased and try to pretend that they're not? Yes, it absolutely does. But hopefully things like Hangouts and Headlines and people that are even better at this critical thinking and reading stuff than I am are out there talking through the issues that these potential platforms, the various people that control them, have in putting news out there. So shorter answer to that longer answer is I'm not in favor of government enforcing requirements to have specific people say specific things on platforms that are not otherwise within government control, because that is just another use of government force that I don't think is very easy to enforce in any event, which is, again, not much of a shorter answer to that longer answer. But I can understand why reasonable people can say it was a good idea in the first instance and could be in favor of it, seeing what's happening now in the world today. All right. So I think that's all the super chats. I think I caught everything. It's been a while since I have done a Hangouts and Headlines with super chats towards the end, so I'm glad I remembered to do them. Otherwise, if you want to support this channel and content like this, please do check out our Patreon and continue to gift memberships or become a member yourself and do those super chats, because every single little bit of all of that helps. I think the Patreon is likely to get a revision very soon. I'm obviously not up for doing the kind of question time, ask me anything type streams anymore. So I might do a last one of that to roll that into a Patreon revision. If you're interested in any of that, please keep your eyes out on that, and I will try to flag it if and when I do that. But otherwise, that support is very helpful. Speaking of ad revenue, as we do with Stephen Colbert, it is significantly down on YouTube, not just because of lack of content on the channel. The viewership and views of the channel have been pretty solid, but it's clear that YouTube itself is having difficulty placing ads in 2025 on this content. So all of that kind of off-platform support through Patreon or through direct patronage like memberships, even through YouTube or super chats, is all very much appreciated. So thank you to everybody for that. But if you can't do that, you're under no obligation to. Just subscribing, really hitting any button on YouTube in connection with this episode or on my channel is helpful to letting Google and YouTube know that people like this, that we aren't just bots making AI content, that people could get something out of this, and it will be shown to more people, and it all helps. So just subscribing, hitting Google buttons, hitting YouTube buttons, telling your friends, everything helps there. Otherwise, thank you so much, and I will catch any other questions or comments. Don't feel like you have to super chat. I'm looking directly at the comments board right now. So let me know if you've got anything that I might help with or that you think I got wrong. I'm totally appreciative of constructive criticism. I know I was speaking pretty fast in the middle of this episode, and so I apologize for that. Still trying to get my pacing right for all of this stuff. But thank you so much for being here throughout the entirety of this show, and thank you for having this conversation with me. All right. Dana says, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Dana. I very much appreciate you being here. Dana says, lots of people don't know they are biased. Everyone is, but if you think you're not, one of the things I like to say here, because people in the comments like to comment on how unbiased and neutral I am, is that I am still human. On the first instance, I'm picking what I want to talk about with you all, right? Like that's one of the things I think people kind of skip on the understanding of where bias exists, which is to say that there is a certain amount of bias or agenda or whatever it is that you want to call it in the outlet, whether it's the New York Times or whether it's Hoeg and Hangouts and Headlines, deciding what it is that they want to talk about. So I'm deciding on that. I'm deciding how I talk about it and what subjects I want to bring up. Like I didn't have to talk about the FCC as part of this topic, but I wanted to as part of all that. So I'm making editorial decisions every day. I try to present them as factually as I possibly can. But for the folks that say, thank you, Rick, for being as neutral or as unbiased as you are, I do my best, and I thank you for that comment. But I am definitely human, and I have my own biases that I try to disclaim as much as I possibly can. Curiouser and Curiouser asks, does anti-SLAPP work in these situations? So that's a statute in most jurisdictions in the United States that says we're going to kick your lawsuit out of court if it is seen as a strategic lawsuit against public participation, against freedom of speech. And the answer is no, not really, because what is happening in the merger context is that they're asking for special dispensation. Skydance and CBS Paramount are saying, okay, we want to make this deal. And now because of what Congress put in place in 1934, we have to go ask the FCC to say this deal is okay. And so that's not a lawsuit separate from anything. That's not a litigation of that scope. And so it doesn't fall under anti-SLAPP or those kinds of concepts. If you're asking about the 60 Minutes lawsuit, it's possible they could have brought something like that. I don't actually know what jurisdiction that lawsuit was brought in, so you'd have to look at what the anti-SLAPP rules for that were. But it's possible that that would have been an active defense that Paramount or CBS could have sought if they decided to litigate the issue instead of settle. So I don't know exactly what you were referring to there, Curiouser and Curiouser, but largely it doesn't apply to this situation. It's not really, it's certainly with Skydance, a private public kind of lawsuit that would result in an anti-SLAPP application. Again, as a lawyer, it's hard to answer hypotheticals. There's a lot of specifics on the ground that could change that answer, certainly. RJ asks, do you have to re-ask questions or are you just going to go back and grab them? I am looking at the current timeline of comments when I get to the questions and comment section. So one of the things I have is a automated message in some of my streams, and I don't always remember to hit the button, is to say, if you've got something you specifically want me to address, then you should ask it at the end when you see this screen, because otherwise I'm not catching things as we go on the fly, and it's a little bit difficult to pull up everything. Thankfully, my community is wonderfully talkative when I have these particular commentaries and Hangouts and Headlines episodes, but it does make it difficult to see specifically what someone might have asked earlier. So if you could ask it again, that would be very appreciative. If you're in another Hangouts and Headlines later on, if I'm, God willing, doing these on the once-a-week basis that I would like to, then if you flag it with an @HoegLaw, I see it a little bit more often. If it's a super chat, they flash on my screen, so I see those a little bit more often as well. But ultimately, if you're a super chat, you're going to get picked up at the end of the episode, as you just saw in this one. And generally speaking, when it's questions and comments time, I'm looking at the current questions for that purpose. So I apologize there. Maybe if I had a producer, I could have people pulling things in for me as I go, but I don't right now. It's just me. And so I'm doing my best. Social Mail says, thank you for the insight. I will continue to watch Colbert with my coffee from Paris, France. As a reader of the New York Times and an avid watcher of CNN and MSNBC, I was convinced it was purely political. Thank you. No, I appreciate that, Social Mail. I can't sit here and tell you that it wasn't. All I can sit here and tell you is that the CNN article raised the red flag for me that they definitely didn't have the evidence that it was. And so that's what I wanted to talk to you all about today. That's where the conspiracy kind of concept comes in. And I'm glad that you were able to take it as well as you were as an avid reader of the NYT and an avid watcher of CNN and NBC. That's the purpose here, right? My purpose is not to tell you what to think. I'm very adamant about that. I'm not a journalist, but I don't think I know any better than you what you should think in the position that you're in. So all I can do is tell you what I see and let you judge for yourself on those points. Joe Beer says, you're doing amazing, Rick. Clapping emoji. Thank you. I feel pretty good. I feel like I'm doing better over the last month or so than I was at certain points in the last year or two. So I appreciate that. I'm certainly trying every day to continue doing better. And I feel like these streams have gone really well. And a lot of that is due to the community. A lot of that is the people that are receptive to this kind of conversation, leaving nice comments, leaving comments that are maybe not so nice, but are at least constructive in a way that is very helpful to the community and the conversation. All right. Witness Multi-Chick says, we need the perspective of our international friends, in my opinion. Blue Heart, thank you. Absolutely. I love to see that. I love to see someone on an international level saying, okay, this is how the United States or this news topic is being presented to me. And that was very helpful to understanding. I love it. I really appreciate all of you from everywhere that make this channel and my ability to do this possible. So thank you. Alrighty, everybody. I think that's it for today's episode. I really appreciate you being here. I'm going to hit the outro now, and hopefully I will be back sometime midweek. I don't think I can set a specific day yet, at 10 a.m. Eastern for another Hangouts and Headlines pretty soon. Keep an eye on this channel also for more virtual legalities, and I appreciate every bit of support and every person you tell that we're having these conversations. So thank you very, very much.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.